And then seemingly overnight, for the very first time in almost a century, the very purpose and utility of office space was questioned at scale because people proved that they could get their work done anywhere.
Attention business owners and decision drivers. If you're looking for new office space, you're in the right place. Keep listening to learn all about location, amenities, and everything else that goes into a successful office.
Hi, it's Kat Pellinero. On today's episode of In the Loop, I am joined by Jon Glass, Executive Vice President and co-lead of the Savills team in Washington, D.C. Hi, Jon.
Hello, Kat. Good to see you. Thank you for having me.
So I guess let's dive in a little. I guess tell us a little bit about you, your experience. I know we worked together a handful of times on transactions.
Hopefully you're easier on me today than you were in that negotiation years ago.
Yeah.
So I'm Executive Vice President, co-lead of the Savills D.C. region. I've been in the business for about 18 years. I started off as an analyst pretty much. And at the time, the company was known as Studley. And we were the first firm to pioneer the platform of representing office users exclusively in the real estate negotiations. And started as an analyst. I put my head down, worked, quickly became more of a strategic advisor. And just last year, or earlier this year, I was asked to be manager of the DC region.
Yeah, that's great stuff.
Thank you.
So let's dive into a little bit of the tenant business and the tenant world that you're working on. I know you represent quite a number of tenants across the region.
Yep, around the region, around the country, around the globe. But most of my practice is focused here in Washington, D.C.
Okay, got it. So when you look back at the transactions that you've worked on, what were some of the biggest drivers that you saw in those that were making office decisions?
Well, I'd say certainly the way that companies view office space and the decisions they make around office space has certainly evolved since when I started my career. The big drivers primarily being rent, location, quality. Those are always still top of the list for most tenants. But other things like sustainability, ESG, wellness, even hybrid work, which really wasn't a common concept until relatively recently. Those have certainly become more emphasized and amplified as of late. But I'd say nothing has been more front and center when companies are looking at the real estate than emphasizing maximizing the employee experience. And because of that, I think the office environment and the conversations we're having about office space are the best they've ever been.
Yeah.
And when you look back, for decades preceding the pandemic, having an office space was more or less a default, right? Chances are, if you had a job, you were required to come into the office to do that job, typically Monday through Friday, 9 to 5. Number one, because that was the unchallenged traditional way of working. And number two, because technology simply wasn't advanced enough to allow you to work from anywhere. Right. And so office space was more or less designed and used in accordance to whatever your industry's best practices and benchmarks were at that time. And so, for example, if you were a nonprofit, the guidance was to lease 250 square feet per employee. And if you were a law firm, the guidance was to lease 700 square feet per attorney. And so space was really more of a commodity. It was more of a dime a dozen. There was certainly nicer space than others, but everybody had it and everybody was expected to work out of one. And then seemingly overnight, for the very first time in almost a century, the very purpose and utility of office space was questioned at scale because people proved that they could get their work done anywhere. It might not be the most effective or productive way of working, but they could get their work done. So what that did was it forced leaders and companies to think critically about how can we create an experience that's actually different from working from home? How can we provide resources that are customized so that people are coming in to do their best work? And because of that, I think people are better off for it. I think space is designed with more intent and more purpose. And it's the best it's ever been.
Yeah. Okay. So what are some of those drivers that you think have positively impacted, those tenants, those employees to come back into the office? What's some of the feedback you've been getting on that?
The stakes are as high as they've ever been because people have higher expectations about their office space, right? When they come into the office, they expect a space and an experience to be better than what they have at home, and that earns their commute. If they're going to an office that doesn't allow them to do their best work, or if there's a workplace policy that is unorganized or lacks purpose, or if they're coming in and they're not around their peers and they're not around their leaders in order to be seen, to be heard, to grow both personally and professionally, they're not going to want to come in, or at least they're not going to want to come in and have any enthusiasm. All those things considered, it's more important than ever. And secondly, real estate is still a top line item on any company's balance sheet, right? It's a costly long-term investment. And therefore, it's worth taking the time to be strategic, to be thoughtful and get it right, because it really is an investment, not just in the actual real estate cost, but investment in your people, investment in the culture, and investment in your mission. So it's more important than ever. Office leasing across the United States was up 10% year over year. Office availability across the United States is down 150 basis points year over year. The amount of sublease space on the market is decreasing for 8 consecutive quarters. And I think with the cooling labor market, like I mentioned, it is certainly emboldening employers to require people to come back. And so we're certainly seeing that in office utilization across the board. So there's still a lot of financial distress out there in terms of the actual tangible assets. And that's a whole nother story I'm sure we'll talk about in a second. But people are coming back and we're starting to see signs of recovery.
So in order to make any one of those decisions, there's a lot of data, a lot of analytics that need to go into that. What have you seen as of recently? What's been helping kind of drive those decisions?
Yeah. I mean, data and analytics, incorporating data and analytics into any strategy development or used to build consensus and drive decision-making is fundamental, right? I think the challenge is there's so much data available that unless it's synthesized and summarized that's in a way that's actually relevant to the end user, it's really useless in my opinion. So the one thing I love about our industry is that it's become much more consultative than just transactional. And so yes, data around market intel and market comps, that's super important, but that's table stakes nowadays. There's so many more people at the table that are influencing real estate decisions, whether it's CHROs, chief people officers, procurement, finance, accounting, legal. Everybody has different priorities and a different vision of what the optimal space should look like, right? And so therefore, the first thing we do is really get the key stakeholders together and ask, what are we solving for? What would constitute a successful outcome? And once we have some of those drivers, we can then create the data necessary to help drive a strategy. And, what's different metrics matter to different types of people and companies. So if you're a private equity-backed growing technology company, you might care about maximizing EBITDA and being more sensitive to lease term commitment and capital outlay. If you're a law firm, you're going to care, you might care about a lot of other things like profit distribution. So understanding who the audience is. If you're a company with a single location, you're going to look at your real estate a lot differently than a company with a global portfolio. An example that comes to mind, I came back from a meeting with a client where they actually reached out to me. They're growing pretty considerably. They had a real need to double their staff from about 25 people to north of 60 in the next 12 to 24 months. They're in a co-working arrangement right now. And they need to be out of their space in 4 months. So they came to me with very critical, detailed metrics of what they envision their future office to be. So what I was able to do is I identified a building that just went through a foreclosure and a new healthy ownership with a lower cost basis that can do aggressive deals. And I found a pre-built spec suite on the front of the building that's fully furnished. And there's 2 adjacent suites next to it that are vacant where we have what's called a ROFR on those spaces, a right of first refusal. And so number one, we accomplished their speed to market. We accomplished their ability to be sensitive to capital outlay because they're moving to a fully built suite. We've got future growth contingency plans where the landlord has to come to us before leasing that out. And we got them under budget. And also we just met with DEMPED, which is the Deputy Mayor's Office of Planning and Economic Development, to talk about incentives available that the district can give them that hit certain growth metrics. So again, this was very tailored to what this particular company needs, which would very likely be a lot different than working with, a company in different industries.
Right. I love that story. What are some things that tenants have overlooked when selecting their office space?
I think from a market perspective, tenants can underestimate the difference between availability and achievability. And if you were to read the major headlines, or if you look at any company's market report, you might see an overall availability rate of 24%. And so naturally, you might think that the amount of quality options is endless. But when you really peel back the layers, it's much more nuanced than that. For example, using Washington, D.C. as an example, the vacancy rate is about 22%. But if you're looking for trophy, high quality product, it's probably 10% and declining because there's no new construction in the pipeline, and there's a lot of large tenants looking for that type of product in order to incentivize their people to come back and make a long-term investment. Similarly, if you are looking at the other segment of the market, the commodity A product, the Class B product, where a lot of that vacancy is concentrated, the reality is a lot of that product is in financial distress. We experienced a prolonged period of time where investors and owners of real estate were borrowing cheap and abundant debt to buy overvalued buildings at cap rates that they thought were going to be stable. And when the interest rate started to rise pretty rapidly, cap rates went up and values went down. And there's a lot of owners out there that have lost their equity, that are faced with refinancing and loan maturities approaching, and they're just simply not in a position to transact. So I can think of a dozen buildings off the top of my head right now in Washington, D.C., where there's probably collectively 1 million square feet of availability in the marketplace, but they simply can't transact because they're underwater. And so those that are looking for office space, you really have to be strategic about, okay, if you're looking for the high-end product, it's very tight. If you're looking for the low-end product, on paper, there's a lot of options, but really when you get into the weeds, it's a lot more limited than you might otherwise think.
So what are some of those landlords doing? I imagine that, I hear that they're trying to be competitive, they're trying to stay creative, or I'm interested, what are you saying?
Look, there's certainly a lot of landlords that are in a challenging position right now. Some of them are working to restructure their loans with their existing lenders. Others are making the educated decision to just hand the keys back and walk away. But, there's certainly in the short term, we're going through a corrective period in the marketplace. So in terms of transactions, finding an opportunity with a healthy landlord, with a healthy capital stack that can actually perform on the terms that are negotiated is absolutely critical in today's market. Now, those that are experiencing trouble, there are some opportunities to do, let's say, a net effective deal, especially in a space that doesn't require a lot of concessions, whether it's tenant improvement dollars or free rent. So you can really take that out of what a market rent would be and then pay an artificially lower rent in exchange for, it just kind of gives the landlord revenue rather than having to come out of cash. So, it's certainly a challenge that is not just that we're seeing all over the United States for sure.
Okay. Yeah. Interesting stuff. So if I were a company that wanted to relocate next year in 2026, what would you advise? What are some things you would highlight?
I'd say it's probably a little late unless you're looking for a pre-built space like I mentioned that I just got that other group. But another thing that tenants underestimate is really the time necessary to go through a very thorough strategic process.
Yeah, let's talk about the timeline.
Let's just say a typical process, we're out in the market 2 years in advance of a lease expiration. In this market here in Washington, especially for large users, I'm working on a transaction for a 2029 start date, 2030 start date. So you really have to get out early to, number one, understand internally what our needs and drivers are. What does the optimal state look like? So then we can go to market and find that. You really want to have your house in order before you get out to the marketplace, because what you communicate to the market matters strategically. So taking the time to understand and go through a thorough workplace strategy process, which can take 3 months, it can take 1 month. It really depends on how fast and how thorough you want to be. But once you're in the market, assuming that you're looking for new space that requires, it's going to be a long-term transaction with a lot of customization, just thoroughly evaluating the market in itself, narrowing down tours, negotiating proposals, that all that takes time. And then once a lease is signed, you're going to need a minimum of 9 months generally to go through the design process, get construction documentation, get permits, build out on all that. So I often say that time is either your best ally or your worst enemy. Nobody wants to have their back against the wall, because if a landlord senses that time is against you, they're going to use that to their advantage.
When you've had a client that's, taken the 2-year timeline to find something and they started the process 2 years ago, by the time they move into the space, has there been a situation where the requirement has changed, and how have you handled that?
Look, I think real estate and business operations are a challenge to align even in the best of times. Right. So let's say, for example, you're starting 2 years early, and therefore the new lease will commence 2 years' time, and you're signing a 10-year lease. You're required to have foresight 12 years out. Right. And so much can occur within your business and can occur within the market and macroeconomic, all types of things can occur that changes. And so we try to negotiate as much flexibility in any lease document as possible, whether that's termination options, contraction options, growth options, ROFRs, ROFOs, all the acronyms that you can imagine. But it's really, and again, that's why it's so important to spend the time upfront to strategically think about best case scenario, where could we be? Worst case scenario, where can we be? And how do we put safeguards within our process to really create as much buffer and as much flexibility as possible. I mean, I've had a number of transactions that I've worked on. Here's one. I pursued a company for 13 years. So I'm a Tufts alum. This person, the CFO, is a Tufts alum. And back in 2012, I reached out to him. He was the CFO of a really large company in Washington. And at the time, we were pitching their business, and I became a finalist. And ultimately, I wasn't selected, and it was like heartbreaking. But actually, I met my wife that night because of that story.
So it worked.
So I won something. So actually, a colleague of mine took me out for drinks because I was so bummed that I didn't get it. And they, unbeknownst to me, he blindly set me up with what is now my wife. Long story short, so the company ends up doing a long-term lease, and I kept in touch with him throughout the process, throughout the 10-year period. And the lease expiration came around, and I pitched it again, and ultimately I won it. Amazing. And so we were in a process where we were really at execution, and then circumstances changed, and I won't get into details, but ultimately they had to walk away. And so you never really know where things are going to go. And that's a risk of our business. Right. But it's, they made the right decision by walking. And really, at the end of the day, that's all that mattered to me. If a transaction is meant to be, then it will happen. But for this part they needed to hit the pause button. And so things change all the time.
So what is working when it comes to, what's attracting tenants nowadays?
As far as buildings, number one, it's financial solvency, right? Like I mentioned, like buildings that can perform with a healthy capital stack, like that is top of the list right now. As far as the actual building themselves, I mean, think about it. People want to come into a space with great light, with great amenities that are healthy, that are really going to provide a different experience that they can otherwise get at home. So I think that it has been an amenity race, not just here in Washington, but throughout the country, where landlords are delivering everything from golf simulators to shared conference rooms to penthouse suites. I mean, look at the amazing space you have here. So I think the buildings that are positioned best are going to be well located. They're going to be, top class amenities. And really those are going to be the winners and have been the winners in this very competitive market.
In one of our previous episodes, we talked about biophilic design. Are you seeing that trend, or what are your thoughts on some of those? Yeah,
no, absolutely. We're constantly thinking about sustainability and biophilic design and everything that is going to impact a healthy building and a healthy experience. In fact, just last week, we had a representative from the U.S. Green Building Council come into our office and talk to us about new LEED version 5 that they've just rolled out. So there's certainly a demand for it as an office user, and there's certainly stricter requirements to deliver healthy buildings from every municipality and jurisdiction where buildings are being developed. So I think that's certainly something that's going to continue to grow in the future. And the more that companies and owners and landlords can incorporate that throughout their buildings. And also, people to get out during the day and having access to public parks and walking trails if you're in a suburban location. All that really matters as well.
So let's talk a little bit about office location and when tenants prioritize that. How do you see that evolving over the next 1 to 5 years?
Yeah. So I think the number one barrier to reentry in the office place is the commute, right?
Yeah.
So I think it's really critical to understand, where are your employees coming from? Are we really going to drive behavior for people to come in that are scattered all over the map? Where are your clients located? Like, do we have a need to be in close proximity to our clients? Are we hosting community events? Are we having them in our space? So that's kind of number one. Where are you recruiting talent? Where are your clients at? And that's always going to be the primary driver to where you set up a location. Certainly being around mass transit, making it as easy as possible for people to get there. That's really going to drive location strategy.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of technology tools out there. We have a very robust labor analytics and workforce planning practice group that is very forward thinking and advising companies on where is the talent that you're looking to fill coming from. Not just today, but where is it coming from? What university systems are really investing in this type of talent, whether it's computer engineering or whatever it might be. That is a place that you might want to set up so you can get this next wave of talent. So it really depends on a lot of factors, but really talent being the primary one.
So one final question, Jon. What's your favorite city and why?
Ooh, my favorite city. Well, obviously I'm partial here in Washington, but let me try and be a little bit creative here. I would say country. Visiting Italy. I visited Italy. In fact, that's where I got engaged. Yeah. I was blown away with Italy. We went to Florence, Venice, Rome, and Positano. And I just think the ease of getting around the city, the character, the charm. So my wife would probably want me to say Florence, since that's where we got engaged. Okay. So let's go with that. Florence. And we'll go with that. Yeah.
If you could improve one thing about it, what would you improve?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, the pizza's pretty good. The wine is pretty good. The walkability is pretty good. I know that this is a lame answer, but really in the 4 days I was there, there really wasn't anything that I could point out that I would change. Okay.
More sun?
More sun. Yeah, there you go. That's a good one. More sun.
I don't know that we can control on that, but Jon, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate you coming by, and this was a great conversation.
This is fun.
Thanks for the insight.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us on another episode of In the Loop. We'll see you next time.
We have more new episodes coming on topics like adaptive reuse, tenant retention, and more. Make sure to subscribe so you'll be the first to hear what's coming up for offices in 2026.